All right, a couple months ago, as you know already, folks, as I've been doing the TV circuit, happen to be doing New Hampshire primary coverage, and this young lady handed me her business card and then also told me a little bit about this book that she had coming out in March. Love to be on the show. I was a fan of her work. She did a great job on the panel that night. She joins us here, Saleha Mohsin. She's a senior Washington correspondent over at Bloomberg News. She's the host of one of my favorite podcasts, the Big Take DC podcast. And the book that she wrote is called Paper Soldiers: How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World Order. You can see it over, I think, my right shoulder here. If you're watching us on YouTube, left shoulder. Nick's got a copy of it. Saleha, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
So excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great talking to you and seeing you again, Saleha. You know, there's a bunch we're going to get into with the pod. Obviously, voter issues are always centered around the economy. But first, let's get into the book for a second because, I was telling you this offline. Nick and I both have our copies of the book here as we start reading this. It's an interesting read, and the high takeaways for our audience that's listening to this, that they hear the title Paper Soldiers. Oh, sounds interesting. Weaponization of the dollar. Oh, I'm kind of hooked. Why don't you take our audience a little bit more inside of what made you want to write the book and what's the book holistically about?
Yeah, what made me want to write the book was that there's a lot of books about the Federal Reserve. There's a lot of books about different Treasury secretaries, their own autobiographies. We have a great hit musical called Hamilton that's about one of the founding fathers who was the first Treasury secretary that this country has had. But there's no book about Treasury. At the same time, I think people don't realize what the role of the Treasury Department is in our democracy, in our economy. The US Treasury Department is the steward of the almighty buck, the US dollar. And banknotes, if you pull one out or if you look at the cover of the book, you'll see that a banknote, a dollar bill says, "In God we trust," printed on it. But actually, it's the strength of US democracy, US institutions that underpin people's faith in the US dollar. And so I was able to draw a connection between our economic power, our currency power, and our democracy. And it actually ties into a lot of what we're seeing today, that the US's role as a superpower on the world stage, as in a leadership role, is on shaky ground. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on with our democracy internally, what's going on globally in other countries, but it also has deep implications for what could happen to the US dollar and the world because of how connected the rest of the world is to the dollar.
So, the opening of your book talks about a pivotal moment being the invasion of Ukraine. And as a fan of history, U.S. and world history, obviously, something that stood out to me even now is 2 years removed from the war. The United States has not fired a single shot. Nor is any country in the world outside of Ukraine defending itself. But you put forward the argument that the currency battle, at least the way the dollar and the way that internally in our government it was being discussed how to address Russia from a currency economic standpoint, perhaps may have been the greatest weapon we could have used, beyond armaments and, typical weapons of war. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, what we've seen, Nick, is that US sanctions have evolved largely since 2001. Sanctions existed before then, but it was run by an office that until 9/11, OFAC, this tiny little office, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, it was just considered the orphan of the Treasury Department, as one former official told me. With 9/11, the US discovered the massive power that comes with holding the world's reserve asset, and that is that we can export our own foreign policy goals and agenda and geopolitical strategies through the dollar. And that's by applying economic sanctions. So if there's someone who is a so-called bad actor, they have brought on humanitarian strife or assaulted another democracy, you name it, the US can say, all right, you are not allowed to use the dollar anymore. Now, that's a very blunt force way of looking at it. There is a spectrum of sanctions where you can slowly tighten the vise and make it harder and harder for a company, an individual, a government or a government official to participate in the world economy. And what we've seen happen is over the course of the last quarter of a century, we've seen how the expanding role of sanctions has given the US a new kind of leverage. the way foreign policy works is that you start with diplomacy. And before, if diplomacy failed, just talking to another country, trying to work things out, if that didn't work, a lot of times the next option was war. Let's send military tanks, let's get our troops and boots on the ground. There wasn't much in between. Economic sanctions is the space in between diplomacy and kinetic action. And it's cheap. We are not spilling American blood. We're not spending money on our own tanks going in and our own people driving those tanks. But at the same time, a lot of other costs come with it in terms of the credibility of the dollar and the country, and what happens to the global economy. So we saw President Biden 2 years ago. The book starts February 26, 2022, leverage the biggest sanctions package on earth, on Russia, on the world's 11th largest economy at the time, a G20 country. And it was the kind of sanctions package that actually caused self-inflicted wounds. If you remember, 2 years ago to the day, we were paying more in gas prices. Americans going to the pump to fill up their tanks had to pay more. And a large part of that was because of what was going on in commodities markets and oil markets because of those Russian sanctions. And so that weaponization has become a pretty sharp edge that the US can wield, and it causes problems at home too.
Saleha, you just kind of landed the plane there and kind of fed into this follow up, because some of the econ stuff, we were joking about this off air about, I failed econ 101. I think I failed. I'd have to check the transcript at Rutgers University.
I don't believe it.
Well, maybe. I definitely passed communications and journalism, but it's one of the things about your book. It's that, it's kind of explaining some of this to the lay person. And one of the things that Nick likes to do here, as he's worked in education for forever, is this kind of moment of literacy. So your book attempts to open, the eyes into how the rest of the world looks at our currency as a form of like that economic superpower that you just mentioned. Can you kind of elaborate on that and kind of break down some more of that? Like, people look at it and they go, oh, I don't get it. The US dollar, inflation. I don't get some of these terms. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. And that's one of the fun things that I got to do, Mike, in the book is, I take people from inside the halls of power in Washington, where big decisions are made inside the Treasury Department, Congress, or the White House. And then you'll see a chapter on what was going on in Moraine, Ohio, which is just a couple of hours from where I grew up in Cincinnati, or Weirton, West Virginia, where the manufacturing sort of the Rust Belt state, the manufacturing economy suffered from globalization, which is underpinned by the dollar. But to get to some of the Econ 101 terms, the book starts off with, there's a chapter called Bob Rubin's Bumper Sticker. And in that chapter, I explain why the dollar and any kind of policy even exists, and how Bob Rubin, who is a pretty storied Treasury Secretary from the Clinton era, he created a mantra. It was the strong dollar mantra that lasted more than 2 decades. And it was, a strong dollar is in the best interests of the nation. And there's a couple of different variations on it. And I explain in the book how there's two types of strength in the dollar. The first is exchange rate, just what the value of the dollar is against the yen or the euro or the pound or any other nation or a combination of currencies. And a strong dollar is good for America. A strong currency exchange rate is good for America because it means that we can buy cheap goods from overseas. And so we have this great consumer-driven economy. Everyone in the world wants to sell to us. If your product or your band or your movie makes it big in the US, you've made it big in the world. And it is cheaper for foreigners to come here and sell those goods. For Americans, it means that we don't have as high inflation, or inflation is at a predictable and stable rate because we can import goods at a lower cost. The flip side of that is what we've seen in the rise of populism, something that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump picked up on before a lot of other people did. And what that is that a strong dollar was not good for everyone in the country. It was not good for the manufacturing sector, which was for a long time the backbone of our economy. Our American-made products you couldn't sell them because everyone thought, well, I can get a Chinese made or Vietnamese or Bangladeshi or Latin America, something made in Latin America, a lot cheaper than this one that was made here a couple of states over because of the exchange rate dynamics. The second component, or the second definition of a strong dollar, is what I talked about earlier, that it gives us this global strength. The whole world runs on dollars. You could be a business tycoon anywhere in the world, or you could be someone, let's say, who picks cocoa beans in Ghana, and you're trying to sell that your product, your chocolate, your cocoa beans to the rest of the world, anyone in the world. You will touch the global financial system to make that sale. That means you will touch the dollar. The dollar is at the center of the whole global financial system.
Quick break from the pod. As always, we are presented by our friends over at SeatGeek. If you need tickets to the biggest concerts, shows, sporting events, MLB season that's starting up this coming week, you got the NBA and NHL playoffs coming up soon. SeatGeek has got you covered. Nick, did you download the SeatGeek app like I told you?
Did. We're excited to use it because we've got obviously the Phillies starting up this season. So I'm excited to take my girls out there and just take full advantage of the perks we get as partners.
That's right, as you should, as should our audience right now. So if you're watching or listening to this, when you download the app, you put the tickets in the cart. When you hit the checkout, there's going to be a little promo code field right there. Do me a favor, enter in the promo code, "Can we please talk?" All one word. You're going to get $20 off that purchase. Download the SeatGeek app or go to SeatGeek.com to get your tickets today.
So, Leah, just thinking about your past in terms of as a reporter, early on, I mean, you in 2016, you're working. So we have this election, obviously. When we think about Trump, obviously from a social standpoint, from a domestic standpoint, obviously there's all kinds of conversations, but from an economic standpoint, in your coverage, what did you find to be some of the chief differences between the previous administration and this one as it relates to a clear economic policy, a policy that is beneficial to the Americans and to the rest of the world, or at least respectful of our impact with the rest of the world?
So I saw the switch from Obama to Trump and then Trump to Biden. So I've covered three Treasury secretaries. To go from Obama to Trump was a really big rupture. And the US went from supporting globalization to looking inward and looking at isolationist policies, looking at populism and protectionism, the tariffs, and a lot of the other things. And those things are characterized as America first, make America great again. Let's get our own manufacturers going. Let's buy made in America products. And the interesting thing, Nick, is that the first State of the Union speech that Joe Biden gave, it was called the Joint Sessions speech in early 2021. When I listened to that, I thought that some of these things, the core domestic economic policies, capitalize a couple of different letters, change the rhetoric a little bit. And it sounds like what Trump was saying, because Biden uses words like buy America and friendshoring, which is a lot like make America great again and a lot like America first.
Look at that. You're feeding into these follow-ups perfectly, because Nick opened the door there about the differences between these administrations. I want to get into something that you do a great job. And like I mentioned, the Big Take DC is a podcast, a production of Bloomberg. You can go check it out wherever you listen to pods. But you guys recently did an episode, again, a moment of literacy on the Federal Reserve and who's overseeing that. Jerome Powell, the guy who was appointed by former President Trump, who was kept in office by President Biden. And there's some things in the episode that you, and I forget who the other reporter that was joining you from Bloomberg, were discussing about. He was recently on Capitol Hill, and the purpose of the Fed is to not be political. It's an apolitical org. It's supposed to be, right? But then President Biden said something about interest rate cuts, and that this is something that the White House had to kind of walk back later on. Can you first kind of explain a little bit more of that exchange, but then also at this 30,000 foot overview, what the Federal Reserve's mission is? A lot of people may not know that. I know one talking to you right now doesn't know that fully. So why don't you explain a little bit more about Jerome Powell's role and how he's almost become politicized, because there's a huge election happening here in November, and economy is always at the top of voter issues and minds. And Donald Trump has said he thinks that Jerome Powell is acting in a political nature towards President Biden, whereas President Biden has said in reverse, I think you're going to see the Fed do some stuff, and you're not supposed to do that. So take our audience inside all of that.
The Federal Reserve is a core part of what makes America's democracy strong, us strong overseas, and our dollar strong. The Federal Reserve is the world's most powerful central bank. It has an immense amount of influence over our day-to-day household costs. Their goal at the goal at the Fed is to stay away from politics and achieve what they call a dual mandate, which is a low jobless rate and keep inflation at a stable, predictable, roughly 2% rate. When those two components or even the politicization component go out of whack, then they have their job cut out for them. Now, their actual mandate from the Congress is their boss. That mandate, looking at unemployment and looking at inflation, their key mechanism is to use interest rates to tinker with the plumbing of the economy, I guess you could say. And that's something that I unpacked on the Big Take DC podcast last week. We aired that in the wake of Powell's visit to Capitol Hill. He had these back-to-back hearings. So I think in 2 days, he testified for 6 hours and was grilled by Senate lawmakers and House lawmakers in their respective financial services committees that oversee what he does. And what he's facing is, for the first time in decades since Trump came on the scene, we've seen a president meddling and talking about the Federal Reserve in the way that they shouldn't, because the Fed has the power to immediately give the economy a kick. They can slash interest rates. All of a sudden, the economy will be juiced up, revved up, and hey, voters are happy. They might say the president had something to do with that. That's why there's a separation of powers, you could say, between the executive branch or any political official and the Federal Reserve. And I go into that a lot in the book. About what happens, some of the ramifications and historical examples of the White House trying to meddle in what the Fed is doing. And what we're seeing now, like you said, Mike, is that, Trump came on the scene, and in 2018, 2019, he called Powell a bonehead. Even though he picked Powell, he said, I want you to be my Federal Fed chair. And then he was unhappy that Chair Powell was exercising independence and talking about raising interest rates when maybe that wouldn't be good for Trump's economy and his reelection bid and his political ambitions. And Biden, in his own manner, is doing the same thing. He should not say anything about the Fed, but he's kind of doing this wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You betcha they're gonna cut interest rates, and you can't deny the fact that a cut in interest rates anytime this year will be good for Joe Biden.
Saleha, when you think about, and I appreciate the connection you're drawing between this administration and the previous one in terms of the fusion or presence of politics as it relates to the Department of the Treasury, or at least the Federal Reserve. You've had the benefit of previously, before covering, the U.S. economy, right? Obviously in another country. I believe it was in Norway, if I remember correctly. What's the difference you find, at least as it relates to that marriage of politics and really our other offices within DC versus in another country in terms of, is it similar? Do you find that the U.S. has been a little unique in the fact that politics is starting to permeate, so many different sectors of the government and our lives? Do we stand alone in there, or just in your experience, is this a trend that you're seeing other places, or are we, a number one, like we allege in many other things in this world?
I love this question. I love being able to talk about Norway for a minute. I did live there for 5 years, and actually my interest in government currency policy, I think the germ of it was when I was living in Norway covering Scandinavian monetary policy and economic policy. Norway is a really small country. I've also lived in the UK, but I didn't cover it as such. But, European countries, it's kind of like if the US was broken up into 50 states and everyone was somewhat individual but trying to work together. Europe is a monetary union, not a fiscal union. So they don't share a budget or a fiscal policy, but they do share interest rate setting and monetary policy, which causes some interesting dynamics. Norway is separate. It's not part of the union like that. In Norway, it's a very provincial country. They have a lot of power of their own because they're the owner of the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund. They have so much oil. They've poured that into just one fund for the future. And they're Europe's biggest investor. So their interest rates and their currency, the Norwegian kroner, has influence on Europe um, because they're a commodities, oil-driven market with this big investment power. But in the U.S., it's just something different. The role on the world stage is much bigger. The responsibility is much bigger. People are looking to the U.S. for help, but also looking to the U.S. to blame problems on the U.S. Um, it's this almost, it's king dollar, so it has the same effect of being a leader that is going to make you happy and unhappy at the same time.
So Leah, before we let you go, one of the things that we like to do here with authors, and like I said, you can go get the book. It's out now wherever books are sold. Paper Soldiers: How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World Order. We like to do this all the time where there's a bookstore. This is it could be a plausible example for you. Your book is in the corner. You see somebody gravitate towards it. They grab it. They look at it. You tap them on the shoulder and you say, "Hey, I wrote that book." Now give them a reason why they should go to the counter and buy the book.
Oh, I love this. This is great. First of all, I think I would buy their book because I think there's something that authors are supposed to do where if you see someone out in the wild with your book, you should buy it because it's the first one that you've seen, which I would definitely do. I think I'm going to carry $30 around my pocket for that. That's such a great, I think my pitch would be that this is a book written by someone with a unique worldview. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I lived in London and Norway. I am now in Washington. I'm trying to connect what happens in all of the parts of the country together and how it affects the rest of the world with a view. I didn't come from like a mainstream background, Ivy League college, that kind of thing. I grew up in the heartland and I am now seeing what happens in the elite policymaking circles. And I see the efforts that people are making to understand the electorate that is in some of the so-called flyover states. But I am trying to help evolve that conversation too.
She does a great job. Like I mentioned, you can check out all of her work over at Bloomberg or go listen to that Big Take DC podcast. I'm telling you, and I told you this in January, I started listening to it. It's one of my favorites. It's on my list there. So Saleha Mohsin, go get the book wherever books are sold. I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program today, giving us some time. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.